sterile wealthy CEO dumped his bride for Mistress on wedding day, but her smile and secret gift destroyed. Alyssa pressed her back against the wall, heart hammering like a trapped bird. Everything, every kiss, every promise, every moment she'd felt seen and valued had been calculated. She was a business decision wrapped in romantic packaging. Have you ever overheard something that changed everything? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. She stood at the altar in front of Charleston's elite, listening to the man she loved announce he couldn't marry her because she wasn't worthy of his name. But when Brandon Whitlock publicly humiliated her for her humble roots and whispered she couldn't give him the family he deserved, Alyssa Monroe didn't cry. She smiled, handed him a velvet box, and walked away, carrying the secret that would destroy his empire within 48 hours. What would you do if the person you love betrayed you in front of 400 people? Have you ever been judged for where you came from? Have you ever discovered someone you trusted was lying about who they really were? This is the story of a woman who turned the most humiliating moment of her life into the most devastating revenge in Charleston history. Stick around to discover how one smile can topple an empire, and why sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous. Hit that like button if you've ever wanted to see someone get exactly what they deserved. Now, let me take you back to where this perfect storm began. She had kept one secret for 3 years, until the day she discovered he had been keeping a dozen. The Miami skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows as Alyssa Monroe sorted donation files at the Children's Charity Foundation, but the view couldn't distract from the voice drifting from Brandon's corner office. Cold, calculated, nothing like the man who whispered sweet words in her ear every night. Training my little charity girl for society has been more work than I expected. Brandon's voice carried that familiar laugh she used to love. But she's finally learning which fork to use at dinner parties. Alyssa's hands stilled on the paperwork. 3 years of late nights building this foundation together. 3 years of believing they were partners in something meaningful. 3 years of thinking love could bridge the gap between her Savannah trailer park and his Charleston mansion. The breeding issue is still a concern, Brandon continued, his voice dropping but not enough. Sienna says the family's worried about genetic quality. You know how these old Charleston families are about bloodlines. Something sinister was brewing behind Brandon's charming facade, a tapestry of lies she was only beginning to unravel. Her mother had warned her about men like this. Wealthy boys who saw working girls as entertainment, never as equals. Have you told her about your little problem yet? The female voice on speakerphone made Alyssa's blood freeze. Sienna, her best friend since college, her maid of honor. God, no. Can you imagine? She probably offered to adopt or some other desperate move. The wedding's in 2 weeks. I just need to get through the ceremony, establish the social connections, then we can figure out how to handle the infertility issue quietly. The papers in Alyssa's hands crumpled. Brandon Whitlock, Charleston's golden boy, heir to a shipping fortune, couldn't father children. And instead of trusting her with the truth, he was discussing her like livestock with her supposed best friend. She really thinks you love her. Sienna's laughter was sharp as broken glass. It's almost sweet how naive she is. Does she still believe that story about meeting at the charity gala being fate? Please. I needed a legitimate charity connection for the tax benefits. She was perfect, hardworking, grateful, easy to mold. Plus the optics of dating someone from her background makes me look charitable without actually being charitable. Alyssa pressed her back against the wall, heart hammering like a trapped bird. Everything, every kiss, every promise, every moment she felt seen and valued had been calculated. She was a business decision wrapped in romantic packaging. The prenup covers everything, right? Sienna asked. Because if she gets half your assets, she's getting nothing. Her signature's already on documents she was too trusting to read carefully. After the wedding, she'll be comfortable but contained, like a well-kept pet. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows across the foundation office as Alyssa carefully orchestrated her next move. Her phone felt heavy as she scrolled to a number she hadn't called in months. the law firm in Savannah that had handled her mother's estate. "Mr. Henderson, it's Alyssa Monroe. I need to see those papers my mother left me. All of them. Tonight." She ended the call and walked to Brandon's office door. He was still on the phone with Sienna, laughing about something else cruel. For 3 years, she'd worked 18-hour days to build something meaningful while he collected tax breaks and social credit. For 3 years, she'd loved a man who saw her as a project. "Brandon," she knocked softly, schooling her features into the grateful smile he expected. "Just a second, babe." He ended the call quickly, all charm and warmth as he looked up. "Working late again? You know you don't have to do everything yourself." "I know. I just want everything perfect for the wedding." The lie tasted like poison, but she'd learned to swallow poison from the best. He stood and pulled her close, the same strong arms that had once made her feel safe, now feeling like a cage. 2 more weeks, and you'll officially be Mrs. Whitlock, ready to be Charleston royalty. "I can't wait," she whispered against his chest, breathing in his expensive cologne while planning his destruction. Have you ever overheard something that changed everything? That moment when you realized the person you loved was wearing a mask? Tell me in the comments below what you would have done in Alyssa's position. Brandon kissed her forehead with practiced tenderness. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we have the final dress fitting with Sienna." Of course, can't disappoint Sienna. As she gathered her things, Alyssa's mind was already 3 steps ahead. The 2-hour drive to Savannah. The papers her dying mother had pressed into her hands with shaking fingers. The secrets about Brandon's family that her mother had taken to her grave. Almost. "Oh, and Alyssa," Brandon called as she reached the door. "Don't forget to practice your posture. The photographer will be watching everything at the ceremony." She turned back with the brightest smile she could manage. "Don't worry, I'll be picture perfect," as she listened to him laugh about training his little charity girl for society. Alyssa reached for her phone and made a call that would change everything. "Mom's lawyer," she whispered to herself. "I need to see those papers you gave me. All of them. Tonight." The elevator doors closed on 3 years of lies, but they were opening on something much more dangerous. Revenge served at exactly the right temperature. The papers her dying mother left behind weren't just memories. They were weapons. The law office smelled of old leather and secrets. Afternoon light filtering through dusty blinds as Mr. Henderson spread documents across mahogany that seemed to hold the weight of decades. Alyssa had driven through the night, her mind spinning with Brandon's cruel words, but nothing had prepared her for what waited in her mother's carefully organized files. "Your mama was a smart woman," Mr. Henderson said, his weathered hands gentle with papers that looked older than Alyssa herself. Smarter than most folks gave her credit for. She knew this day might come. The first document made Alyssa's breath catch. Stock certificates. Whitlock Shipping Corporation. Dated 15 years ago. Signed by Robert Whitlock, Brandon's father, and witnessed by 3 lawyers. "I don't understand." Alyssa traced the elegant script with trembling fingers. Mom cleaned office buildings. She never had money for stocks. She didn't buy these, child. These were settlement for what Robert Whitlock took from your family. Picture this. Veteran legal officers had pieced together a tapestry of financial breadcrumbs that even they found sinister. The next folder contained bank records, correspondence, and photographs that painted a story Alyssa had never heard. Her mother, young and beautiful, working as a bookkeeper for Monroe Family Construction. Her grandfather's small but successful building company. Robert Whitlock, then a rising star in Charleston shipping, had courted her mother for months while secretly embezzling funds from Monroe Construction to finance his own expansion. $60,000. Mr. Henderson pointed to highlighted figures. In 1995, that was enough to destroy a small family business. Your grandfather never recovered from the loss. The company folded within 6 months. Alyssa stared at a photograph of her mother at 22, standing in front of a construction office that bore her family name. Beautiful, confident, holding the hand of a man who looked exactly like Brandon, his father. Robert promised to marry her, the lawyer continued. Right up until the day the money disappeared and he announced his engagement to Charleston debutante Margaret Hayes, Brandon's mother. The room felt smaller as the truth crashed over her. Her mother hadn't been abandoned by some random wealthy man. She'd been systematically destroyed by the Whitlock family patriarch. Her own family's business dissolved to fund their empire. The pregnancy came after the betrayal. Mr. Henderson said quietly, "Your mother never told Robert about you, but she never forgot what he owed. These stock certificates, legitimate ownership." 20 years later, when Robert needed investors for a major expansion, your mother's lawyer, my predecessor, approached him with an interesting proposition: pay what was owed with interest or face a very public lawsuit about the embezzlement and abandonment. What happened next would thrill veteran officers of long-term justice. Robert Whitlock had quietly transferred 40% of his company to shell corporations controlled by Alyssa's mother, believing he was paying off a woman who would disappear forever. She never sold a single share, Mr. Henderson smiled. Just collected dividends and waited. Your mother always said the Whitlock men thought they were smarter than everyone else. That pride would be their downfall. Alyssa's hands shook as she opened the final folder. Medical records, financial statements, and surveillance photos that made her stomach turn. Brandon's infertility diagnosis, hidden from everyone. His father's tax evasion schemes. Corporate fraud spanning 2 decades. How did she get all this? Your mother cleaned their offices for 3 years after the settlement. Rich folks never notice the help. They leave papers everywhere, have private conversations, never thinking someone might be listening who actually matters. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Alyssa processed the magnitude of what she held. Not just revenge, justice. Her entire family had been destroyed to build the Whitlock fortune, and now she owned nearly half of it. "The wedding's in 10 days, she whispered. "Perfect timing. The annual board meeting is next month. As a major shareholder, you could force changes." Or, his eyes twinkled with something that might have been pride, "you could time certain revelations for maximum impact." Behind the scenes, something far more sinister than simple heartbreak was brewing. This wasn't about a cheating fiancé or a shallow best friend. This was about systematic destruction, generational theft, and a family that had built their empire on other people's ruins. "There's more." Mr. Henderson pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "Your mother's final instructions. She said to open this only if you discovered the truth about Brandon yourself." Alyssa's fingers traced her mother's handwriting on the envelope. "For my daughter, who deserves to know she comes from fighters, not victims." The drive back to Charleston felt different. The highway that had always felt like a bridge between 2 worlds now felt like a path to war. Her phone buzzed with texts from Brandon, sweet messages about wedding preparations, lies wrapped in digital affection. Each message strengthened her resolve. Tomorrow she would smile at dress fittings, laugh at Sienna's jokes, play the grateful charity girl one last time. But underneath the performance, she would be calculating, planning, orchestrating something beautiful in its precision. What would you do if you discovered your family had been wronged for decades? Would you seek justice or let sleeping dogs lie? Drop your thoughts below about whether the sins of one generation should follow to the next. The lawyer's words echoed as she drove back to Charleston. Your mother made sure you'd never be powerless. The question is, what are you going to do with that power? Alyssa stared at her engagement ring, catching the dashboard light, and smiled for the first time in weeks. Brandon Whitlock thought he was marrying beneath himself. He had no idea he was about to marry his family's reckoning. She returned to Charleston carrying dynamite disguised as wedding plans. The bridal boutique mirrors reflected 3 women: the bride, the maid of honor, and the ghost of trust that had died between them, each reflection showing a different version of betrayal. Alyssa smoothed her hands over the silk wedding dress while watching Sienna fuss with the train, both of them performing roles they perfected over months of planning. "You look absolutely radiant," Sienna gushed, her voice honey-sweet with practiced affection. "Brandon's going to die when he sees you walking down the aisle." If only she knew how prophetic those words were. "The dress is perfect," Alyssa agreed, studying her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked like a Charleston bride. Elegant, refined, everything Brandon had molded her to become. But behind her eyes was something new, something that would have terrified him if he'd been smart enough to recognize it. "I still can't believe you're marrying the Brandon Whitlock." The boutique owner fluttered around them, clearly starstruck. "Charleston royalty. Your children will be part of such an important family legacy." The words hit their target perfectly. Alyssa watched Sienna's face tighten almost imperceptibly, the same expression she'd worn during that phone call. The concern about genetic quality and bloodlines. "Actually," Alyssa said carefully, "we've talked about waiting on children. Brandon's career is so demanding right now." "Oh, but honey," Sienna jumped in too quickly. "You know how his family feels about continuing the Whitlock line. His mother asks about grandchildren every time I see her." What happened next would thrill veteran officers of psychological warfare. Alyssa was orchestrating something far more sinister than anyone could predict, using truth as her weapon of choice. "Sienna, you seem to know a lot about Brandon's family expectations." Alyssa turned from the mirror, her voice light but her eyes sharp. "More than I do, apparently." The boutique fell silent except for the ambient sound of traffic outside. Sienna's reflection froze, hand still adjusting silk that suddenly felt like chains. You know how Charleston families are. Traditional values and all that." "Of course." Alyssa stepped off the fitting platform, moving closer to her supposed best friend. "It's sweet how much you care about our future. Tell me, what else does his family discuss when I'm not around?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. Sienna's eyes darted to the boutique owner, clearly calculating how much truth she could reveal in front of witnesses. "Nothing important, just normal family stuff. Normal family stuff." Alyssa repeated the words like she was testing their flavor. "Like the tax benefits of marrying someone from my background? Or maybe concerns about whether I'm trainable enough for Charleston society." Sienna's face went white. "Alyssa, I don't know what you're—" "I heard the call, Sienna. Yesterday evening. Every word." The boutique owner excused herself, sensing drama she didn't want to witness. The mirrors suddenly felt like an interrogation room, reflecting guilt from every angle. "You don't understand," Sienna's voice cracked, the honey sweetness evaporating. "Brandon loves you. He's just scared about disappointing his family. Scared about disappointing his family. Or scared about revealing he can't give them the grandchildren they're demanding." The words landed like physical blows. Sienna sank into a chair, her carefully constructed mask crumbling. "He told you. He didn't have to. See, that's the thing about secrets, Sienna. They have a way of coming out, especially when people get careless about who might be listening." Behind the scenes, something darker was lurking than simple betrayal between friends. This was about systematic deception, about two people who'd spent months planning to use her, without considering she might have plans of her own. "He's ashamed," Sienna whispered. "The fertility issues, his father's expectations, the family legacy. He thinks if he can just get through the wedding. Then what? Years of pretending? Fake attempts at pregnancy, while he figures out how to explain away his little problem, without damaging his reputation? It's not like that. Then what is it like, Sienna? Explain to me how the man I'm supposed to marry in 6 days has been discussing my breeding potential with my maid of honor. Help me understand how my best friend became his consultant on managing my expectations." The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Sienna finally looked up, tears streaming down her face. "He said it would be kinder this way. Let you have the wedding, the status, the security. Deal with the children issue later, when you were more established in the family." Kinda. Alyssa tasted the word like poison. Like how it was kinder to let me work 18-hour days building a foundation that was really just his tax shelter. The foundation does good work. The foundation is a performance, Sienna. Just like this friendship, just like this engagement. Alyssa turned back to the mirror, studying the woman in white silk who'd been prepared for sacrifice. But something had shifted in the past 24 hours. The victim was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. "Are you calling off the wedding?" Sienna asked, her voice small. "Oh no, the wedding's happening exactly as planned." Alyssa's smile in the mirror was sharp as broken glass. Brandon gets his perfect Charleston ceremony. His family gets their photo opportunities. You get to stand beside me as maid of honor, smiling for the cameras. Then why? Because some lessons can only be taught in front of an audience, Sienna. And some people need to learn those lessons publicly. Have you ever had to pretend everything was fine while your world was falling apart? How did you keep your composure when you discover betrayal from multiple people you trusted? Share your story in the comments about maintaining dignity under pressure. As Sienna helped zip up the wedding dress one final time, her hands shaking, Alyssa made her final decision. The wedding would go on as planned, but the groom would get a very different ending than he expected. 6 more days, Alyssa said, her voice soft as silk and twice as dangerous. 6 days of playing the grateful charity girl one last time. But after that, Brandon gets to learn what happens when you underestimate someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. The mirror reflected a bride transformed, and Sienna finally understood she was looking at someone who'd stopped being a victim the moment she learned the truth. The city's most eligible bachelor had everything, except the one thing that mattered most to his legacy. The country club's chandelier cast dancing shadows across faces that had judged worth by bloodlines for generations, unaware that their golden boy was built on foundations of sand. Brandon Whitlock raised his crystal tumbler of aged bourbon, his Harvard ring catching the light as Charleston's elite gathered for what they assumed was a celebration. "To my beautiful bride-to-be," Brandon announced, his voice carrying the confident timbre that had charmed investors and seduced hearts. "For more days until I make an honest woman out of her." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Men in navy blazers and women draped in pearls, all playing their roles in Charleston's eternal theater of old money and older secrets. Behind the scenes, something darker was lurking in the picturesque setting, or so it seemed to those who didn't know the real truth about to unravel. "Honest woman," chuckled Robert Whitlock Sr., Brandon's father, his weathered hands gripping his own drink. "Son, you're getting a good one. Hardworking, grateful, knows her place. That's rare in women these days." Brandon's groomsmen nodded approvingly. These were men who'd grown up assuming the world owed them everything, who'd inherited their success along with their surnames. They saw Alyssa as Brandon's charitable project, proof of his good heart and democratic values. "She's certainly dedicated to that little foundation of yours," commented Charleston's mayor, a man whose election had been funded by Whitlock's shipping contributions. 18 hours a day, they say. That's the kind of work ethic we need more of. "Oh, she's trainable," Brandon replied, and the words carried just enough edge to make several men chuckle knowingly. "Takes direction well. You know how these working-class girls are. They appreciate what they're given." The ambient sound of clinking glasses and muted conversation filled the private dining room while Brandon held court, unaware that his words were being recorded by the same catering staff who'd served his father's generation. The same staff who remembered when Robert Whitlock had destroyed small businesses to build his empire. "What about the family situation?" asked Charleston's district attorney, a longtime family friend. "Any concerns about compatibility?" Brandon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The fertility issue was his deepest shame, hidden behind expensive suits and carefully constructed charm. His father's expectations weighed on him like chains. "Continue the Whitlock bloodline, produce heirs worthy of the family name, maintain the dynasty." "We're in no rush," Brandon said carefully, "building the foundation, establishing her in society first. These things take time when you're bridging different worlds." "Smart approach," Robert Sr. nodded approvingly. "Let her settle into the family expectations before adding pressure. Some women need more guidance than others." Picture this. As the evening progressed, veteran officers of Charleston's social hierarchy discussed Alyssa like she was livestock being prepared for breeding, completely unaware that their picturesque world was about to spiral into chaos. Brandon's phone buzzed with a text from Alyssa. "Hope you're having fun at the boys' club. See you tomorrow for final preparations. Love you." The message made him smile. She was so predictable, so grateful for any attention he gave her. Tomorrow would be their last day before the wedding. and he planned it perfectly. Final dress alterations, dinner with his parents, one last performance of their beautiful love story. She really has no idea, does she? Asked his college roommate, James, leaning in with bourbon-heavy breath. About the medical situation? Brandon's expression darkened, and she never will. What she doesn't know won't hurt her. We'll cross that bridge when we need to. What if she figures it out? She won't. Alyssa's many things, but suspicious isn't one of them. She trusts me completely. The words hung in the air, like a prediction waiting to be proven wrong. Around them, Charleston's power brokers continued their conversations about tax shelters and political favors, completely missing the eerie undercurrent of approaching disaster. The prenup solid? Robert Sr. asked quietly. Bulletproof. She signed everything without reading it carefully, too excited about the wedding to focus on legal details. Brandon's smile was sharp with satisfaction. Even if she gets curious later, she'll find exactly what we want her to find. What they didn't know was that earlier that evening, Alyssa had spent 3 hours with Charleston's most expensive divorce attorney, not to plan a separation, but to understand exactly what she'd signed and how to use those documents as weapons. The night before the wedding, Brandon's cruel toast to his groomsmen echoed through the private room. Tomorrow, I officially upgrade from trailer park to trust fund. The words were overheard by exactly the wrong person. The catering manager who had been Alyssa's mother's best friend, who remembered when the Monroe family had been destroyed by Whitlock greed. As Brandon stumbled home, confident in his victory over a woman he'd systematically underestimated, his phone lit up with messages from wedding vendors, family members, and society photographers. Everyone was excited for Charleston's event of the year. Do you think people who judge others by their background deserve what's coming to them? What's your experience with people who treat others as less than equal based on social class? Share your thoughts about entitled behavior and its consequences. The golden boy of Charleston fell asleep that night dreaming of photo shoots and society pages, completely unaware that tomorrow's ceremony would indeed make headlines, just not the kind he was expecting. The morning would bring final preparations, last-minute details, and the moment when Alyssa Monroe would stop being a victim and become something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Wedding mornings are supposed to be filled with butterflies, not battle plans. Magnolia Hall stood like a southern belle dressed for court, white columns gleaming in morning sun while inside. The bride applied her makeup with the precision of a general preparing for war. Alyssa's hands were steady as she traced her lips with pale pink gloss, each stroke deliberate and controlled. "You're glowing, honey," said Miss Betty, the makeup artist who'd been beautifying Charleston brides for 30 years. That's the look of a woman in love. If only she knew it was the glow of a woman who'd spent the night signing legal documents and transferring assets into offshore accounts her lawyers had established. Love had died 3 days ago in a Miami office. What remained was something far more dangerous. The bridal suite buzzed with controlled chaos, bridesmaids steaming dresses, photographers testing angles, florists making final adjustments to arrangements that had cost more than most people's cars. Through the tall windows, guests were already arriving, Charleston's elites stepping from luxury vehicles in their ceremonial best. "The groom's getting nervous," whispered one of the coordinators. He's been pacing the groom's suite for an hour, asking about every detail. Imagine this. Fluorescent lights cast long shadows in the bridal preparation room as Alyssa carefully orchestrated the final pieces of her sinister plan, her expression serene while her mind calculated timing down to the minute. Her phone displayed a series of messages from Brandon. "Can't wait to see you, beautiful. This is it, our perfect day. Love you forever." Each text strengthened her resolve. Forever. The word tasted bitter after everything she'd learned about his definition of commitment. "Miss Monroe." A courier appeared in the doorway, holding a small velvet box. "Special delivery." The sender said it was urgent. Alyssa accepted the box, her heart hammering as she recognized the return address. Henderson and Associates, her mother's law firm. Inside, nestled in cream silk, was a simple silver locket. Her mother's locket, the one she'd worn every day until she died. The note was brief. She want you to have this today. For strength. Mr. Henderson. Alyssa's fingers trembled as she opened the locket, revealing 2 photographs. Her mother as a young woman, radiant and hopeful, and a baby picture of Alyssa herself. On the opposite side, tucked behind her own photo, was something that made her breath catch. A tiny key. "Everything all right, dear?" Miss Betty asked, noticing Alyssa's pause. "Perfect," Alyssa whispered, fastening the locket around her neck where it would rest hidden beneath her dress. The key felt warm against her skin, a final gift from a mother who'd never stopped fighting for justice. Downstairs, the ceremony space was transforming into something from a fairy tale. White roses and magnolia blossoms created archways, crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across silk-draped chairs, and Charleston society photographers positioned themselves for the perfect shots. Brandon stood at the altar in his custom tuxedo, every inch the golden boy his family had raised him to be. Handsome, confident, heir to a shipping fortune built on other people's ruins. He checked his pocket watch, his grandfather's watch, another symbol of generational wealth built on systematic destruction. "You look good, son," Robert Whitlock Sr. clapped his shoulder. "Ready to continue the family legacy?" "More than ready," Brandon replied, his voice carrying none of the nervousness the coordinator had mentioned. This was his moment of triumph. The charity girl from Savannah was about to become his perfect Charleston wife, grateful and contained. What he didn't know was that upstairs, Alyssa was reviewing final legal documents on her phone. The stock transfers were complete. The medical records were scheduled for release. The financial audit that would destroy his father's tax haven was set to trigger automatically if she didn't cancel it by midnight. "It's time," announced the wedding coordinator, her voice bright with professional enthusiasm. The bridal party lined up in the hallway. 6 bridesmaids in soft lavender, led by Sienna, whose hand shook as she gripped her bouquet. Behind them, Alyssa stood alone for a moment, studying her reflection in the antique mirror that had witnessed decades of Charleston brides. The woman looking back was someone new. Not the grateful charity girl Brandon had molded, not the victim her circumstances had created, but something else entirely. Someone who understood that the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting justice. Her bouquet felt heavier than flowers should, weighted by the small velvet box hidden within the blooms. Inside that box were 2 items that would change everything. A USB drive containing 20 years of evidence, and the key from her mother's locket. The key to a safety deposit box that held the original documents proving the Whitlock family's crimes. The wedding march began, its familiar notes floating through Magnolia Hall like a funeral dirge disguised as celebration. 400 guests rose to their feet, phones and cameras ready to capture Charleston's event of the year. "Showtime," Alyssa whispered to her reflection, then turned toward the doors that would open onto her destiny. As the massive doors swung wide, revealing the aisle lined with Charleston's most powerful families, Alyssa felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete control. Every step toward the altar was calculated. Every smile was strategic. Every moment was orchestrated for maximum impact. Have you ever had a moment where you knew everything was about to change forever? That calm before the storm feeling when you hold all the cards? Tell me about a time you had to gather all your courage for one defining moment. Brandon's face lit up as she appeared, his relief visible from 50 feet away. He'd been nervous about her chickening out, about her discovering his deceptions. But here she was, walking toward him with that grateful smile he'd come to expect. What he didn't understand was that gratitude and revenge were the same expression, especially when delivered by a woman who'd learned to smile through anything. As Alyssa walked up those courthouse steps, Brandon appeared one last time, not to apologize, but to make a threat that would show everyone he still didn't understand who he was dealing with. "You think this is over?" he snarled. But Alyssa's response would become the most quoted comeback in Charleston history. The velvet box in her bouquet felt heavier than the ring on her finger and infinitely more dangerous. 400 witnesses thought they were attending a wedding. They had no idea they were watching an execution. The cathedral acoustics of Magnolia Hall carried every footstep as Alyssa glided down the aisle, her her train flowing behind her like spilled moonlight. Charleston's elite rose in their silk and diamonds, phones discreetly positioned to capture the moment their golden boy claimed his prize. The organ's wedding march echoed off marble columns, while afternoon sunlight painted rainbow patterns through stained glass windows. Brandon stood at the altar looking like every woman's dream, tall, handsome, perfectly groomed in his custom tuxedo. His smile was radiant as he watched her approach, relief and triumph mixing in his expression. Behind him, his groomsmen stood at attention while his parents beamed from the front row, already planning the society page headlines. Sienna's hands trembled as she adjusted Alyssa's train, her face pale but determined to play her role. The other bridesmaids smiled for the cameras, blissfully unaware they were about to witness Charleston history. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Matthews, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years performing ceremonies for Charleston's finest families. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Brandon Robert Whitlock and Alyssa Rose Monroe." The words echoed through the hall as guests settled into their seats, programs rustling, jewelry catching the light. Society photographers positioned themselves for the perfect shots while local news cameras rolled discreetly from the back. This wedding would be featured in Southern Living, Charleston Magazine, and every society blog from Savannah to Richmond. "Marriage is a sacred bond," the Reverend continued, "built on truth, trust, and mutual respect." Truth, trust, respect. The words landed like physical blows, but Alyssa's expression never wavered. She stood perfectly still, the picture of bridal serenity, while her mind counted down the seconds until everything changed. Brandon reached for her hands, his touch warm and familiar. For just a moment, she remembered what it had felt like to believe his tenderness was real. Then she remembered his laughter as he described training his little charity girl for society. "Brandon," Reverend Matthews turned to the groom, "do you take Alyssa to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" This was the moment. The moment when Brandon could have surprised everyone, could have chosen honesty over performance. Instead, his smile widened as he prepared to deliver his carefully rehearsed vows. "Actually, Reverend Matthews," Brandon's voice carried clearly through the hall, "I need to say something first." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't part of the program. Alyssa's grip tightened on her bouquet, but her expression remained serene. "Alyssa," Brandon turned to face her directly, his voice taking on that patronizing tone she'd heard too many times. "I want everyone here to understand what kind of man you're marrying, what kind of family you're joining." The hall fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the soft whir of air conditioning. For 100 people leaned forward, sensing drama. "You come from nothing," Brandon continued, his voice growing stronger with each cruel word. "A trailer park in Savannah, a single mother who cleaned offices, no family money, no social connections. Most men in my position would never look twice at someone from your background." Gasps echoed through the hall. This wasn't romantic. This was humiliation disguised as declaration. Alyssa stood perfectly still, her smile never faltering, while Charleston's elite watched their golden boy reveal his true nature. "But I saw potential in you," Brandon pressed on, drunk on his own sense of superiority. "I saw someone who could be molded, trained, shaped into the kind of wife a Whitlock man deserves. Someone grateful enough to know her place." As investigators would later piece together, the breadcrumbs of this orchestrated downfall had been laid with sinister precision, creating an eerie atmosphere that veteran officers would find palpable. But Brandon was too intoxicated by his own cruelty to notice the stillness in his bride's expression. "The truth is," Brandon's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the hall, "you could never give me the family I deserve, the bloodline my family requires. You're genetically inferior, Alyssa, but you're grateful, and that's enough." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Society matrons clutched their pearls. Men who'd known Brandon since childhood looked uncomfortable. Even his groomsmen shifted nervously. But Alyssa Monroe smiled. Not the grateful, submissive smile Brandon expected. Not the broken expression of a woman destroyed in public. She smiled like someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Thank you, Brandon," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "Thank you for showing everyone exactly who you are." She reached into her bouquet and withdrew a small velvet box, the same box that had been burning a hole in her flowers for the past hour. "I have a gift for you too," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Something to remember this moment by." The velvet box landed in Brandon's palm with a soft thud that somehow echoed louder than the gasps from 400 guests. His confident smile faltered as he felt the weight of whatever was inside. "Open it tonight," Alyssa whispered, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "When you're alone with your thoughts and your shame, open it and remember that some people can't be trained, molded, or shaped. Some people fight back." Would you have kept your composure in that moment? What would you have said to someone who humiliated you like that in public? Comment below with how you would have handled such public betrayal. She turned to face the crowd, 400 faces staring back in shock and fascination. Charleston's elite, who'd come expecting a fairy tale, were getting something far more memorable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alyssa's voice carried the authority of someone who'd finally found her power. "I want to thank you all for witnessing this moment, for seeing the true character of the man your society has elevated and celebrated." She began walking back down the aisle, not running, not fleeing, but walking with the dignity of someone who just won a war that no one else knew was being fought. Behind her, Brandon stood frozen at the altar, the velvet box trembling in his hands, while 400 guests sat in stunned silence. Inside that box were two items that would destroy him: a flash drive containing evidence of 20 years of family crimes, and a single key to secrets that would unravel everything the Whitlock name represented. The wedding march had never sounded more like a funeral dirge. She had 48 hours to disappear before the bomb she planted exploded. But Alyssa Monroe had never been one to run from fireworks. The penthouse office that had once symbolized Brandon's success now felt like a prison cell, floor-to-ceiling windows offering no escape from the scandal spiraling beyond his control. He sat behind his mahogany desk, still wearing his tuxedo from the wedding that never was, staring at the velvet box like it contained a live grenade. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since he'd stumbled out of Magnolia Hall 2 hours ago. Text messages, voicemails, social media notifications. Charleston society was having a collective meltdown over what they'd witnessed. "Mr. Whitlock," his assistant's voice cracked through the intercom. "Channel 4 is here for a statement. So, is the Charleston Post, and your father's been calling every 10 minutes. No statements." Brandon's voice was hoarse from screaming at wedding vendors, trying to salvage something from the disaster. "And tell my father I'll call him back." But he wouldn't call back. He couldn't face Robert Whitlock Sr.'s rage, couldn't explain how 3 years of careful planning had exploded in front of Charleston's most influential families. The wedding was supposed to be his coronation, proof that he could manage both business and personal affairs with the same cold efficiency that built the family fortune. Instead, it had become his public execution. The velvet box sat unopened on his desk, taunting him. Alyssa's final words echoed in his mind. "Open it tonight, when you're alone with your thoughts and your shame." What happened next would thrill veteran officers of corporate espionage. The sinister tapestry Alyssa had woven was beginning to unravel Brandon's entire world in ways not predictable by any playbook. His laptop pinged with an email notification, then another, then a flood of messages that made his blood turn to ice water. The subject lines told a story that would destroy everything. Urgent. Board meeting called for emergency session. Stock price alert. WHDL down 15% after hours. Medical records leaked to press. Response needed. Federal investigation opened. Legal counsel required. Brandon's hands shook as he opened the first email. The board of directors had received an anonymous package containing medical records, financial documents, and what appeared to be evidence of tax evasion spanning multiple years. An emergency meeting was called for the next morning. The second email contained a link to a news article already published online. Charleston CEO's secret infertility revealed at failed wedding. The story detailed everything: his hidden medical condition, his cruel treatment of Alyssa, even quotes from guests who'd witnessed his altar confession. But it was the third email that made him reach for the bourbon hidden in his desk drawer. Federal investigators had received a tip about irregularities in Whitlock Shipping's financial records. They were opening a formal inquiry into potential fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement dating back to his father's generation. Behind the scenes, something far more sinister than a simple revenge plot was brewing. The picturesque facade of Charleston's elite was spiraling into an eerie nightmare they couldn't control. Brandon finally opened the velvet box with trembling fingers. Inside, nestled in black silk, were two items that made his world tilt sideways. A USB drive labeled "The Truth About the Whitlock Family" and a small brass key with a safety deposit box number engraved on the side. His laptop showed 17 missed calls from Sienna. When he finally answered, her voice was shrill with panic. "Brandon, what the hell happened? The news is saying you humiliated her in front of everyone, that you called her genetically inferior." "I was trying to show dominance," Brandon's voice cracked. "Establish authority. Show everyone I was choosing her despite her background. You showed everyone you're a monster." My phone's been ringing nonstop. Reporters, bloggers, even my agent. They want to know if I knew about your medical condition, if I was part of some conspiracy. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. But Brandon, this is bad. Really bad. The video's already online. Someone recorded the whole thing. It's going viral." Brandon pulled up social media on his phone and watched his reputation die in real time. Hashtag Charleston's worst groom was trending. The video of his altar speech had been shared thousands of times, with comments ranging from disgusted to celebratory. People were calling Alyssa a hero for walking away with dignity. "There's more." Sienna's voice dropped to a whisper. "My doorman said FBI agents were asking about you, about your family's business." Brandon, what did she find? The USB drive felt hot in his palm. Whatever evidence Alyssa had collected was enough to bring federal investigators into the picture. Tax fraud, embezzlement, crimes that could destroy not just his reputation, but his freedom. "I have to go," he said, ending the call before Sienna could respond. The office felt smaller with each passing minute. Outside his windows, Charleston's skyline glittered like diamonds scattered on black velvet, but the view that once filled him with pride now felt like a prison. Every building represented someone who'd witnessed his humiliation. Every light was a household discussing his downfall. Do you think revenge is ever justified? When someone destroys your dignity in public, do they deserve to have theirs taken away? Share your thoughts on whether Alyssa went too far or not far enough. His phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. The medical records were just the opening act. Wait until they find out about the missing funds. Ugh, missing funds? Brandon's heart stopped. He hadn't seen any missing funds in the company books. But then again, he'd trusted his father's accountants, his family's lawyers, the financial advisors who'd managed Whitlock Shipping for decades. As the sun set over Charleston, painting his office in blood-red light, Brandon realized the truth. Alyssa hadn't just collected evidence of his personal failures. She'd uncovered systematic crimes spanning generations, financial conspiracies that could bring down his entire family. The Velvet Box had been a declaration of war. And somehow, while he'd been playing games, she'd already won. Empires built on lies don't just fall. They implode, taking everyone nearby down with them. The news vans lined Charleston's most exclusive street like vultures, their satellite dishes pointing skyward while neighbors who once courted Brandon's favorite and now closed their curtains and turn away. By dawn, the Whitlock mansion was under siege by reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers who'd driven from across the state to see Charleston's golden family brought low. Brandon hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in his penthouse office, going through financial records with the desperate focus of a man searching for lifeboats on a sinking ship. What he'd found made his blood run cold. Shell companies, offshore accounts, tax shelters that looked legitimate on the surface but fell apart under scrutiny. His father's empire wasn't just built on other people's money. It was actively stealing from the government, from investors, from anyone foolish enough to trust a Whitlock handshake. "Sir," his assistant's voice shook as she entered with the morning papers. "I'm sorry, but you need to see these." The headlines were brutal. Charleston's cruelest groom exposed. The wedding from hell. How Alyssa Monroe became a hero by walking away. But it was the business section that destroyed him completely. Whitlock shipping under federal investigation for tax fraud. Behind the scenes, something far more sinister than a simple revenge plot had been orchestrated. The eerie silence that had once protected Charleston's elite was spiraling into chaos as the truth behind their picturesque world continued to unravel with palpable intensity. The phone rang constantly. Investors demanding explanations. Board members calling emergency meetings. Client canceling contract. The Whitlock name, which had opened doors for 3 generations, was now toxic. Brandon, Sienna appeared in his office doorway, her usually perfect makeup streaked with tears. "I came as soon as I could get past the reporters." "You shouldn't be here," Brandon said without looking up from the newspapers spread across his desk. "Your career can't survive being associated with me right now." "That's what my agent said." Sienna's voice was small, defeated. "He dropped me this morning. Said the scandal was too big, too ugly. Nobody wants to work with Brandon Whitlock's accomplice." The word accomplice hit like a physical blow. That's what people were calling her. His partner in cruelty, the friend who'd betrayed Alyssa's trust. Social media was brutal to women who participated in hurting other women, and Sienna was learning that lesson in real time. She recorded everything. Sienna continued, sinking into the leather chair across from his desk. "The phone calls, the meetings, everything we said about her. My lawyer says she probably has enough evidence to destroy both of us legally." Brandon's computer pinged with another email. This time, it was from his own lawyers, the prestigious Charleston firm that had represented his family for 40 years. They were withdrawing from his case, citing irreconcilable conflicts of interest and potential criminal liability. Even his lawyers were abandoning ship. "The stock price is in free fall," Brandon said, staring at his phone screen. "Down 40% since yesterday. The board's meeting this afternoon to discuss removing me as CEO. What had once been a sinister tapestry of corruption was now being rewoven into something that even veteran corporate officers found both terrifying and inevitable. The complete collapse of a family empire built on systematic fraud." "What about the evidence she has?" Sienna asked. "The USB drive and the key?" "I haven't looked yet." Brandon's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid of what I'll find." "You have to look. If there's criminal evidence, you need to know so your lawyers can prepare a defense." "What lawyers?" Brandon laughed bitterly. "Did you miss the part where they all fired me?" The intercom crackled again. "Mr. Whitlock, there are federal agents here to see you. They have a warrant." The room went silent except for the distant sound of reporters shouting questions outside. Federal agents. Warrants. The nightmare was accelerating beyond Brandon's ability to control or understand. "Show them in," Brandon said, his voice hollow. 2 agents in dark suits entered, their expressions professional but grim. The woman flashed her badge while her partner surveyed the office like he was memorizing evidence. "Mr. Whitlock, I'm Agent Sarah Chun with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We have a warrant to search these premises and seize financial records related to Whitlock Shipping Corporation." "Of course you do." Brandon stood slowly, his world tilting sideways. "Let me guess. You receive an anonymous tip with very specific information about where to look." "We don't discuss our sources," Agent Chun replied. "But I will say this investigation extends far beyond your personal conduct yesterday. We're looking at decades of potential fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement." Sienna gathered her purse with shaking hands. "I should go. Actually, Ms. Hayes," the male agent stepped forward, "we'd like to speak with you as well. You were close to both Mr. Whitlock and Ms. Monroe. You might have information relevant to our investigation. Have you ever watched someone who seemed untouchable finally face consequences? How did it make you feel? Justice served or too harsh? Let me know in the comments whether you think Brandon deserved this complete destruction." As federal agents began boxing up financial records, Brandon's phone rang one final time. The caller ID showed his father's name, but Brandon couldn't bring himself to answer. How do you tell the man who built an empire that everything he created was about to be exposed as a lie? Instead, he walked to his office windows and watched Charleston spread out below him. The city that had worshipped his family for generations was now celebrating their downfall. Social media posts showed people toasting Alyssa's courage, sharing stories of their own encounters with Whitlock arrogance. The golden boy was learning what it felt like to fall from grace, and the landing was going to destroy everything he'd ever known. The knock on Brandon's door came at midnight. Not reporters, not lawyers, but the sound of his world officially ending. The agents had found everything Alyssa wanted them to find, and tomorrow would bring charges that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. Real power isn't about money or status. It's about knowing exactly when to use the secrets you've been keeping. The FBI conference room felt smaller than the church where it all began, fluorescent lights humming overhead as agents spread evidence across tables. A paper trail of corruption spanning decades. Brandon sat in an uncomfortable metal chair, his expensive suit wrinkled from a sleepless night, while his court-appointed attorney shuffled through documents that would destroy his family forever. "This is impressive work," Agent Shin said, holding up financial records that traced money laundering through 3 generations of Whitlock businesses. Someone spent years collecting this evidence. Someone with access, patience, and a very specific motivation. Picture this. As investigators dove deeper into the sinister web, veteran officers found themselves unraveling a tapestry of crimes that seemed orchestrated across generations, creating an ambient sense of inevitable justice. The evidence was devastating. Tax returns showing millions in unreported income. Shell companies created to hide assets from creditors and ex-wives. Embezzlement from client accounts dating back to his father's early business deals. But it was the final folder that made Brandon's world collapse completely. Monroe Family Construction. Agent Shin read from a file thick with bank records and legal documents. Your father systematically stole from this small family business in 1995, using the embezzled funds to finance Whitlock Shipping's major expansion. Brandon stared at documents he'd never seen before, evidence of his father's crimes laid out with surgical precision. Every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every lie that had built their fortune was documented with photographs, witnesses, and legal proof. The victim's daughter, the agent continued, has been collecting this evidence for 20 years. She inherited not just her mother's trauma, but also legitimate ownership in your company through a settlement your father thought would stay buried forever. The room spun as the truth hit him like a physical blow. Alyssa hadn't just been his fiancée. She'd been his family's creditor, his father's victim, the daughter of the woman Robert Whitlock had destroyed to build his empire. Every dollar you've ever spent was stolen from her family. Agent Shin's words echoed off the stairwell walls. Your trust fund, your education, your lifestyle, all of it built on money embezzled from people who trusted your father. Brandon's attorney leaned over to whisper urgent legal advice, but the words sounded like they were coming from underwater. Everything he believed about his family, his legacy, his right to Charleston's respect, all of it was a lie built on systematic theft. Ms. Monroe has been very cooperative, Agent Shin added. She provided us with financial records, witness testimony, and evidence of ongoing tax fraud. She also made it clear that her goal isn't personal revenge. It's justice for all the families your father destroyed. The agent pulled out another folder, this one labeled with names Brandon didn't recognize. The Monroe family wasn't his only victim. We've identified at least 12 small businesses that Robert Whitlock systematically looted between 1990 and 2010. Construction companies, restaurants, retail stores, all destroyed so your family could grow richer. What happened next would thrill veteran officers of long-term justice planning. The sinister precision with which Alyssa had documented not just personal betrayal, but systematic crime spanning multiple decades. She could have destroyed you privately, the agent continued. Sued for damages, exposed the tax fraud, reclaimed her family's stolen assets. Instead, she waited. She documented everything. She built a case that would bring justice not just for herself, but for every family your father victimized. Brandon's phone buzzed with a text message. Despite everything, he glanced at the screen. It was from Alyssa. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, but some truths are too big to stay buried. Your father destroyed my family to build his empire. Now you get to learn what that feels like. We're prepared to offer a plea agreement," Brandon's attorney said desperately. "Full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges." "That depends," Agent Chen replied, "on how much cooperation we're talking about. This investigation has expanded beyond tax fraud. We're looking at money laundering, racketeering, and systematic fraud dating back 30 years. The fluorescent lights felt harsh and unforgiving as Brandon processed the magnitude of the situation. He wasn't just facing financial ruin. He was facing decades in federal prison for crimes his father had committed before he was even old enough to understand them. "There's something else," Agent Chun said, producing a final document that made Brandon's heart stop. Ms. Monroe legally owns 42% of Whitlock Shipping Corporation through the original settlement agreement. As the majority shareholder's heir, she has the right to force the sale of company assets to repay victims of your father's crimes. The room went silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of Charleston traffic. Everything Brandon had inherited, the company, the reputation, the social standing, belonged to the woman he'd humiliated at the altar. Do the sins of the father pass to the son? Should someone pay for their family's crimes? Or does justice have limits? Tell me your thoughts on generational responsibility and whether Brandon deserved this complete destruction. She's not interested in running a shipping company, Agent Chen added, but she is interested in liquidating assets to create a fund for victims of corporate fraud. Your family's wealth, redistributed to the people your father destroyed. Brandon closed his eyes and saw his future clearly for the first time. Federal prison, financial ruin, the Whitlock name associated forever with crime and cruelty. Everything his great-grandfather had built, everything his father had stolen to expand, everything Brandon had taken for granted. Gone. But somewhere in Charleston, Alyssa Monroe was building something new from the ashes of his family's empire. Something honest, something that helped people instead of destroying them. The agent's final words hit Brandon like physical blows. Your father didn't just abandon Alyssa's mother. He embezzled from her family's business and used those funds to build your shipping empire. Every success you've celebrated was built on someone else's destruction. The room spun as Brandon realized the terrible truth. Alyssa wasn't just his victim. She was his creditor, his judge, and his executioner, all wrapped in wedding silk. And somehow, that felt like exactly what he deserved. A city built on secrets and old money learned what happens when the foundation cracks. Everything falls at once. The courthouse steps where Charleston's powerful once posed for charity photos now swarmed with reporters and protesters, signs reading "Justice for Alyssa," waving like battle flags in the humid air. What had started as one woman's wedding day humiliation had become a reckoning for an entire social system built on lies and inherited privilege. Alyssa stood at the top of those courthouse steps, no longer the grateful charity girl Brandon had tried to mold, but something entirely new, a woman who'd turned personal betrayal into systemic justice. She wore a simple navy dress instead of designer clothes, her mother's locket visible at her throat, and spoke to the crowd with the quiet authority of someone who'd finally found her voice. "This was never about revenge," she said, her words carrying clearly through the humid Charleston air. "This was about truth, about justice for families who were destroyed so others could prosper." The crowd below was unlike anything Charleston had ever seen. Not just society matrons and business leaders, but working families, small business owners, people who'd been ground down by systems designed to protect wealth at their expense. They held signs with names of businesses destroyed by Whitlock fraud, faces of people who'd lost everything to corporate greed. The eerie silence that had once protected Charleston's elite was spiraling into chaos as the sinister truth behind their picturesque world continued to unravel with palpable intensity. The Monroe family wasn't the only victim. Alyssa continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Over the past week, 17 families have come forward with evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and systematic theft by Whitlock Shipping and associated companies. Behind her, federal agents led Brandon down the courthouse steps in handcuffs. His fall from Charleston royalty to federal prisoner had taken less than a week, but the crimes he was paying for had been building for 30 years. "Mr. Whitlock," reporters shouted questions as he passed. "Any comment on the charges? Do you plan to cooperate with federal investigators?" Brandon kept his head down, his expensive suit wrinkled from a night in federal custody. The golden boy who'd humiliated her at the altar now looked like what he'd always been underneath, a weak man propped up by stolen money and inherited privilege. But Alyssa's focus wasn't on Brandon's destruction. It was on construction, building something meaningful from the wreckage of his family's empire. "The Magnolia Foundation," she announced to the crowd, "will be funded entirely by assets recovered from Whitlock Shipping's liquidation. Our mission is simple: provide legal aid, financial assistance, and emotional support to families victimized by corporate fraud." The crowd erupted in cheers. This wasn't just justice, it was transformation. Money that had been stolen from working families was being returned to help working families. Wealth concentrated in offshore accounts was being redistributed to fund legal clinics, business loans, and educational scholarships. "We're not just seeking justice for past crimes," Alyssa said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to weaponize quiet strength. "We're building systems to prevent future victims." Corporate accountability isn't just about punishment, it's about protection. Local news cameras captured every word, while social media exploded with support. Hashtag Justice for Alyssa had evolved into hashtag Accountability Matters, a broader movement demanding transparency from Charleston's elite families. What had once been a sinister tapestry of corruption was being rewoven into something that even veteran community organizers found inspiring. Systematic change driven by personal courage and strategic planning. "Ms. Monroe," a reporter called out, "Brandon Whitlock claims he was unaware of his father's crimes. Do you believe he was truly innocent?" Alyssa's smile was sharp but not cruel. Ignorance isn't innocence when you benefit from stolen money for 30 years. Brandon chose not to ask questions because he liked the answers he was getting. In the crowd, she spotted faces she recognized. People from her old neighborhood, colleagues from the charity foundation, even some of Charleston's elite who'd finally chosen the right side of history. But it was the young woman near the back who caught her attention, holding a sign that read, "My sister's voice matters too." After the press conference, the woman approached with tears streaming down her face. "Ms. Monroe, I'm Brandon's cousin, Sarah. He did the same thing to my sister 10 years ago. Used her for social appearances, then discarded her when she wouldn't stay quiet about his family's criminal activities." Alyssa handed her a business card embossed with magnolia blossoms. "The Magnolia Foundation, where silence ends and justice begins. We officially open next month, but we're already taking cases." Have you ever seen an entire community's perspective shift overnight? When the powerful finally face consequences and the powerless find their voices. Share a time you witnessed real change happen in your community. The sun was setting over Charleston as the crowd dispersed, painting the historic district in golden light. The same streets that had witnessed generations of inequality were now seeing something new. Accountability, transparency, and justice served not just in courtrooms but in community organizing. Alyssa walked down those courthouse steps one final time, no longer the woman who'd been humiliated at an altar, but someone entirely new. She'd learned that the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building something so beautiful from the wreckage that future generations never have to face the same battles. As Alyssa prepared for the Foundation's first board meeting, she received an unexpected email that made her pause. From Brandon Whitlock, Federal Prisoner Number 847291. Subject: I need to tell you something important. Something about your mother that you don't know. She stared at the message for a long moment, then hit delete. Some conversations were over, Some truths belonged to the past. Her future was about building something new, not relitigating old wounds. Charleston's golden boy had finally learned what accountability looked like, and somehow that felt like enough. Some people learn humility through hardship. Others have to have it carved into them with surgical precision. They faced each other on the courthouse steps like gunfighters at high noon. Charleston's elite watching from behind tinted windows as their former golden boy made his last stand against the woman he'd underestimated. Brandon had been released on bail pending his federal trial, his ankle monitor hidden beneath expensive trousers that couldn't disguise how much weight he'd lost in county lockup. Alyssa. His voice cracked on her name. 3 months of legal proceedings having stripped away the confidence that once made him Charleston's most eligible bachelor. I need to talk to you. She turned from the foundation volunteers she'd been addressing, her expression calm but alert. The woman who'd once hung on his every word now looked at him like he was a stranger, which she supposed he always had been. Brandon, I heard you made bail. How generous of your father's old friends to post bond for someone facing 30 years in federal prison. The words hit their target. His remaining supporters were disappearing daily as more evidence surfaced. More victims came forward. More of his family's crimes reached the light. The Charleston Social Register was quietly removing the Whitlock name from membership rolls and charity boards. You destroyed everything, Brandon said, his voice rising with desperate anger. My family, my company, my reputation. You took it all because I hurt your feelings. What happened next would thrill veteran officers of psychological warfare. Alyssa's final gambit was so sinister in its simplicity that even seasoned investigators found the orchestrated precision both beautiful and terrifying. I didn't destroy anything, Brandon. I just stopped protecting her lies. The crowd that had gathered included news cameras, foundation supporters, and curious onlookers drawn by the drama of Charleston's most infamous couple meeting face-to-face. Social media was already buzzing with live updates from the scene. You could have talked to me, Brandon pressed, stepping closer with the desperation of a man who'd lost everything. We could have worked something out. Instead, you burned it all down. Work something out? Alyssa's voice carried clearly across the courthouse plaza. Like how your father worked something out with my mother. Like how you worked something out with all those other women you used and discarded? The reference to other women made Brandon's face flush red. Over the past months, 6 more women had come forward with stories of Brandon's manipulative behavior, his pattern of targeting vulnerable women and discarding them when they became inconvenient. That's different. Those were just what, Brandon? Just women who didn't matter because they didn't have trust funds? Just people whose pain was acceptable collateral damage for your comfort. Behind the scenes, something beautiful was happening that most people couldn't see. The women Brandon had hurt were finding each other, supporting each other, healing together. His destruction had accidentally created a network of survivors who were stronger together than they'd ever been apart. I loved you. Brandon's final desperate plea hung in the Charleston air, pathetic and hollow. The words that followed would become the most quoted comeback in Charleston history, shared millions of times across social media, and eventually taught in communications classes as an example of perfect rhetorical precision. No, you didn't. Alyssa's voice was steady, sure, carrying the authority of someone who'd finally understood her own worth. You loved the idea of me. You loved having a grateful project to show off. You loved the tax benefits and the charitable optics. She stepped closer, close enough that the news cameras caught every word. But you never loved me, Brandon, because you never saw me. You saw a role you needed filled, a character in your story about what a generous, enlightened man you were for choosing someone beneath your social status. The crowd was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. This wasn't just a personal confrontation. It was a masterclass in standing up to manipulation, in refusing to be gaslit by someone who'd systematically abused your trust. Love doesn't humiliate people at altars. Love doesn't discuss genetic quality behind closed doors. Love doesn't build itself on lies, stolen money, and systematic fraud spanning 3 generations. Brandon's face went white as she continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. But you're about to learn what love actually looks like. Real love, the kind that builds instead of destroys, that lifts people up instead of tearing them down. She gestured to the crowd around them, foundation volunteers, community organizers, families who've been helped by the legal aid clinic that was already operating out of donated space. This is love, Brandon. Using your family's stolen wealth to help the people your father victimized. Turning your company's assets into scholarships for kids from trailer parks like the one I grew up in. Creating legal clinics so working families can fight back against corporate fraud. The cameras captured Brandon's expression as the truth hit him like a physical blow. His destruction hadn't just been about personal revenge. It had been about transforming systematic injustice into systematic healing. What's the most powerful comeback you've ever heard someone deliver? Have you ever watched someone completely dismantle a manipulator with nothing but truth? Share your best examples of people standing up to bullies in the comments. The foundation has helped 43 families recover stolen assets in the past 3 months, Alyssa continued. We've provided legal representation to 62 victims of corporate fraud. We've created a scholarship program that will send kids from working-class families to college for the next 20 years. Brandon stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Not the grateful charity girl he'd tried to mold, but the formidable woman she'd always been underneath. Your mother's other victims are telling their stories too, Alyssa said, her final words carrying the weight of generational justice. 12 families destroyed by your father's greed, and every one of them getting their day in court thanks to evidence you helped us gather. Brandon's face went completely pale. Other victims? Did you think my family was the only one? Your father spent 30 years systematically looting small businesses. Construction companies, restaurants, retail stores, all destroyed so your family could live in mansions built on other people's dreams. The crowd began to murmur as the full scope of the Whitlock family crimes became clear. This wasn't just about one abandoned woman and one cruel wedding. It was about systematic predatory behavior spanning decades. She waited at that train station every July 17. Just in case, Alyssa said, her voice dropping to something that felt like a whisper but carried to every corner of the plaza. My mother waited for your father to do the right thing for 20 years. But some people never learn. Some people think their actions don't have consequences. Brandon stood there in his expensive suit and ankle monitor, finally understanding that he wasn't the victim in this story. He never had been. He was simply the latest generation of men who thought their wealth made them untouchable. But Alyssa Monroe had proven him wrong, and Charleston would never be the same. Revenge is a dish best served cold, but justice? Justice is served at exactly the right temperature to burn the guilty and warm the innocent. The judge's gavel fell with the finality of a funeral bell, each word of Brandon's sentence echoing through a courtroom packed with people he'd wronged, a room that felt more like a celebration than a trial. 15 years in federal prison for tax evasion, fraud, and conspiracy. His father, Robert Whitlock Sr., had received 25 years and would likely die behind bars. As the sinister chapter of Charleston's corruption finally closed, investigators marveled at how one woman's orchestrated plan had unraveled decades of picturesque lies, creating something beautiful from the ashes. Alyssa sat in the front row, not with triumph on her face, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice finally served. Beside her sat 12 other women, victims of Whitlock family crimes spanning 3 decades, united now in healing and advocacy. The defendant will surrender himself to federal marshals immediately, Judge Martinez announced, her voice carrying no sympathy for the man who'd once believed his wealth made him above the law. Brandon stood in his orange jumpsuit, the designer suits and Harvard confidence stripped away to reveal the scared, weak man he'd always been underneath. His ankle monitor had been replaced by handcuffs, his penthouse traded for a 6x8 cell in federal prison. But the real victory wasn't Brandon's imprisonment. It was what had grown from the wreckage of his family's empire. The court also approves the Victim Restitution Fund, Judge Martinez continued, to be administered by the Magnolia Foundation under Ms. Monroe's direction. Total assets recovered from Whitlock family accounts, $47 million, to be distributed to victims and their families. $47 million. Money that had been stolen from working families, hidden in offshore accounts, used to buy mansions and yachts, while the people it was stolen from struggled to pay rent and medical bills. Additionally, the court recognizes the extraordinary cooperation of MS. Alyssa Monroe, whose 20-year investigation provided the evidence necessary to bring justice to multiple generations of victims. The gallery erupted in applause. Not just polite courtroom clapping, but genuine celebration from people who'd waited decades for this moment. Small business owners whose companies have been destroyed, families who'd lost their homes, workers who'd been cheated out of pensions. Do you believe in karma? Have you ever seen someone truly get what they deserved after years of escaping consequences? Tell me about a time justice was finally served in your life or community. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed as Alyssa emerged with her legal team. She declined all interview requests during the trial, letting the evidence speak for itself. But today, she had something to say. This was never about destroying Brandon Whitlock, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the humid Charleston air. This was about building something better from the ruins of systematic corruption. Behind her, the Magnolia Foundation's volunteers distributed informational packets about their services, legal aid for fraud victims, business loans for entrepreneurs from working-class backgrounds, scholarships for first-generation college students. The foundation has already helped recover stolen assets for 89 families, Alyssa continued. We've provided legal representation in 43 corporate fraud cases. We've created educational programs that teach people how to recognize and report financial crimes. The questions from reporters focused on Brandon's sentence, but Alyssa kept redirecting to the foundation's work, to the systematic changes that would prevent future victims. 15 years seems light for the damage he caused, called out a reporter from the Charleston Post. Prison time is just one form of justice, Alyssa replied. The real justice is ensuring this never happens to anyone else. It's creating systems that protect working families from corporate predators. The crowd included familiar faces, people from her old neighborhood, colleagues from the original charity foundation, even some of Charleston's elite who'd finally chosen accountability over complicity. But the most meaningful presence was the young woman holding a sign that read, "My voice matters now." Sarah Whitlock, Brandon's cousin who'd approached Alyssa months ago, now served on the foundation's board of directors. Her sister's case had been one of the first they'd helped pursue, resulting in a settlement that paid for trauma counseling and career retraining. The Whitlock family pattern of abuse extended far beyond financial crimes, Sarah said when reporters asked her to comment. Brandon's personal cruelty was just the visible part of a system designed to use and discard vulnerable people. As the crowd dispersed, Alyssa walked back into the courthouse one final time. In the victim services office, she met with Maria Santos, whose family restaurant had been destroyed by Robert Whitlock's embezzlement in 2003. $30,000, Maria said, tears streaming as she signed papers that would restore her family's stolen savings with interest. He took $30,000 and destroyed everything we'd built over 20 years. It wasn't your fault, Alyssa said, the same words she'd said to 88 other victims over the past year. And now you get to rebuild stronger than before. This was the real victory, not Brandon's imprisonment, not the destruction of his family's reputation, but the moment when victims stopped being victims and became survivors with resources to thrive. The foundation's next project was already underway. A business incubator for entrepreneurs from working-class backgrounds, funded entirely by liquidated Whitlock assets. Restaurants, construction companies, tech startups, all the dreams that had been crushed by Whitlock greed were getting second chances. As Alyssa left the courthouse for the final time, she passed the spot where Brandon had made his desperate plea months earlier. The man who'd humiliated her at an altar, who'd called her genetically inferior, who'd built his entire life on stolen money and systematic cruelty, was now federal prisoner number 847291. But she wasn't thinking about Brandon anymore. Her mind was on tomorrow's board meeting, next month's scholarship recipients, and the construction site where the Magnolia Foundation's new headquarters would rise from the ground where a Whitlock warehouse once stood. Justice had been served, but more importantly, something beautiful was being built from the ashes. She rose from the ashes of humiliation to build an empire. Not of money, but of voices that refused to stay silent. The building that once housed Brandon's corrupt shipping office now bore a new sign. The Magnolia Foundation, where silence ends and justice begins, its gleaming letters catching the Charleston sun like a beacon of hope. 1 year after the wedding that never was, Alyssa stood in her corner office, looking out over the same harbor where Whitlock ships had once carried goods bought with stolen money. What had once been a sinister tapestry of corruption was being rewoven into something picturesque and healing. As Alyssa orchestrated a transformation that veteran community leaders found both inspiring and revolutionary. Ms. Monroe, her assistant, knocked on the open door. The scholarship committee is ready for you, and Channel 4 wants to schedule the anniversary interview. Anniversary? It felt strange to mark the date that had once been planned as her wedding day. Instead of celebrating marriage to a man who'd seen her as a project, she was commemorating the birth of something far more meaningful, systemic change that had already transformed dozens of lives. The scholarship committee meeting filled the foundation's largest conference room with energy that would have been impossible a year ago. 12 recipients sat around the table. Kids from trailer parks and housing projects, first-generation college hopefuls whose dreams had been funded by liquidated Whitlock assets. Jalen starting pre-med at Charleston Southern this fall. Announced committee chair Sarah Whitlock, Brandon's cousin who'd become one of Alyssa's most trusted allies. Full scholarship plus living expenses funded by assets recovered from his uncle's tax fraud. The irony was beautiful. Brandon's stolen wealth was sending kids from backgrounds like Alyssa's to medical school, law school, engineering programs. Every scholarship was a middle finger to the class prejudice that had built the Whitlock fortune. Maria's restaurant reopens next month, added another board member. The loan from our small business recovery fund let her family rebuild what was destroyed 20 years ago. This was what victory looked like. Not Brandon in prison, though that felt satisfying. Not his family's reputation in ruins, though Charleston society had finally learned that wealth didn't equal worth. Victory was Maria Santos flipping the sign from closed to open on the restaurant that had been her family's American dream. The afternoon brought the part of her work that still felt surreal. Meeting with Charleston's remaining elite families, the ones smart enough to choose accountability over complicity when the Whitlock empire crumbled. The Harrison Foundation wants to partner with us, reported the development director during their monthly strategy meeting. They're offering matching funds for our corporate fraud prevention program. Old Charleston Money was slowly recognizing that protecting corrupt families hurt everyone, including themselves. The smarter dynasties were publicly supporting the Magnolia Foundation, understanding that accountability made their own reputation stronger, not weaker. What happened next would thrill veteran organizers of systematic change. Alyssa had transformed personal revenge into a movement that was spreading beyond Charleston, inspiring similar foundations in cities across the South. We're getting calls from Birmingham, Atlanta, and New Orleans, her legal director announced. Families who've seen our work want to start similar programs in their communities. The model was elegant. Use assets recovered from corporate fraud to fund legal aid, business loans, and educational opportunities for the communities that have been victimized. Turn stolen wealth into legitimate opportunity. Transform systematic exploitation into systematic empowerment. Next month's board meeting includes a special guest, Sarah said with a smile that held secrets. Someone who wants to make a very public apology. Alyssa raised an eyebrow. Over the past year, several of Brandon's former associates had quietly reached out to make amends, to contribute to the foundation, to distance themselves from the Whitlock family's crimes. But public apologies were rare in Charleston's pride-obsessed social scene. The afternoon's final meeting was with the documentary crew that had been following the foundation's work for 6 months. What had started as a story about a wedding day revenge had become something larger, a case study in how individual courage could create systematic change. The footage from the courthouse scene is powerful, the director said, reviewing clips on her laptop. But the real story is what you've built since then, the families whose lives have been transformed. The documentary would premiere at the Charleston Film Festival, with proceeds funding the foundation's expansion into rural South Carolina. Hollywood had already called about movie rights, but Alyssa wasn't interested in dramatizing her story for entertainment. She was too busy living it. As evening fell over Charleston, Alyssa walked through the foundation's main floor, past the legal aid clinic where attorneys worked pro bono cases, past the small business incubator where entrepreneurs refined their plans, past the tutoring center where college volunteers help high school students navigate applications. If you could start a foundation to right a wrong, what would it focus on? What cause would you champion if you had the resources to make a real difference? Share your vision for justice in the comments. The building buzzed with activity even at 7 p.m. Night classes for adults finishing their GEDs, support groups for fraud victims, planning meetings for community organizers. This was what power looked like when it was used to build instead of destroy. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the documentary trailer online. Wanted you to know how proud Mom would be. A friend of the family. The message made her smile. Her mother's friends had been watching the foundation's growth with something approaching awe. The scared girl who'd cleaned offices and worked multiple jobs to survive had somehow raised a daughter who transformed Charleston's power structure. But the message that really mattered came from Maria Santos. Restaurant opens Monday. First meal is on the house for the woman who gave my family our dreams back. As Alyssa locked up the building that night, she passed the memorial wall, photos of all the families destroyed by Whitlock crimes, their stories finally told, their losses finally acknowledged. But surrounding those photos were new pictures, graduation photos, business openings, families reunited, and dreams restored. 1 year after Brandon Whitlock had tried to humiliate her into grateful submission, Alyssa Monroe had built something he could never understand, a legacy based on lifting others instead of crushing them. Tomorrow would bring new victims seeking help, new opportunities to transform pain into power, new chances to prove that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about making sure the story ended with healing instead of hatred. They say the best revenge is living well, but Alyssa Monroe proved the best revenge is making sure no one else has to live through what you did. Charleston's spring air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms as Alyssa walked through the historic district, no longer an outsider looking in, but a woman who had rewritten the city's story with her own hands. The same streets that had once made her feel small and unwelcome now felt like home. Not because she'd been accepted by Charleston's elite, but because she'd forced them to become worthy of her presence. The eerie silence that had once protected Charleston's secrets had been replaced by something far more beautiful. The ambient sound of voices that would never be silenced again, creating a new tapestry of truth and justice that even veteran community organizers found inspiring. Ms. Monroe, a young girl, ran up to her outside the foundation's headquarters, her mother following with embarrassed apologies. "Are you the lady who helps people fight back against mean rich people?" Alyssa knelt down to the girl's eye level, smiling at the simplicity of the question. "I help people find their voices when someone tries to take them away. My daddy says you made the bad man go to jail who hurt your feelings." Something like that. Alyssa agreed, though it was so much more complicated than hurt feelings. It was about systematic abuse, generational theft, and the courage to speak truth to power, even when that power seemed untouchable. The Foundation's second anniversary gala was tomorrow night, not in some fancy ballroom, but in the community center where Alyssa had once volunteered, serving families who looked like hers. The guest list included scholarship recipients, small business owners who'd rebuilt after corporate fraud, and attorneys who'd won cases they never thought they could fight. Picture this final transformation. What had once been a sinister moment of orchestrated cruelty had become something beautifully ambient, as Alyssa's journey from victim to victor created a ripple effect that was changing lives across the South. The anniversary interview requests are getting insane, her communications director said during their weekly strategy meeting. 60 Minutes, Good Morning America, 3 book publishers, and 2 movie studios. Same answer as always, Alyssa replied. We'll talk about the foundation's work, not my personal story. The real story is the people we've helped, not the man who tried to destroy me. But privately, she knew her personal story mattered because it showed other women that you could survive public humiliation and build something meaningful from the wreckage. The foundation received dozens of letters weekly from women who'd found the courage to leave abusive relationships, report workplace harassment, or start businesses after seeing what Alyssa had accomplished. The afternoon brought her favorite part of the job, reviewing scholarship applications. This year's pool included the daughter of a woman whose family restaurant had been destroyed by Whitlock fraud, the son of a janitor who'd witnessed corporate crimes but been too afraid to report them, and a young man whose small construction company had been systematically looted by Brandon's father. Full circle, she murmured, reviewing the application from Marcus Monroe. No relation, just a coincidence of names that felt like destiny. His essay described growing up in poverty after his grandfather's construction business was destroyed by rich people who thought they could steal from working families without consequences. His grandfather had been one of Robert Whitlock's earliest victims. What would you do if you had the power to change a broken system? How would you use your experience of injustice to help others find their voices? Tell me your vision for turning pain into power. The gala preparations filled the community center with energy that reminded Alyssa why she'd chosen this venue over Charleston's fancier options. This was where real people gathered, where families celebrated graduations and wedding receptions on budgets that wouldn't cover a single floral arrangement at places like Magnolia Hall. The caterers here, announced Sarah Whitlock, who'd become not just a board member, but a genuine friend. And she has something special planned. A menu featuring dishes from every restaurant we've helped reopen. Maria Santos entered carrying covered trays that filled the room with aromas of hope and survival. Her family's restaurant wasn't just rebuilt, it was thriving, featured in food magazines and visited by tourists who came to Charleston specifically to support businesses with stories of resilience. This is for you, Maria said, unveiling a cake decorated with magnolia flowers, and the words were silence ends. For the woman who gave my family our voice back. The evening's program would include speeches from scholarship recipients, business owners who'd rebuilt with foundation loans, and legal aid clients who'd won cases against corporate fraud. But the moment Alyssa was most nervous about was the video message from federal prison. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked as they tested the projection system. Having Brandon speak at your anniversary gala feels like giving him a platform he doesn't deserve. He doesn't get a platform, Alyssa replied. He gets 30 seconds to apologize publicly for crimes that hurt dozens of families. And then we move on to celebrating the people who've rebuilt from his destruction. The video arrived that afternoon. Brandon in an orange jumpsuit, thinner and grayer than he'd been at sentencing, speaking directly to the camera with what appeared to be genuine remorse. I spent 36 years believing that wealth made me better than other people. His recorded voice would tell tomorrow's crowd. I treated Alyssa Monroe as less than human, and I participated in my family's systematic theft from working families. I can't undo the damage, but I can acknowledge it publicly and support the foundation's work to help my family's victims. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something, a public acknowledgement of harm, a small piece of accountability in a world that rarely demanded it from powerful men. As the sun set over Charleston, painting the harbor in shades of gold and rose, Alyssa stood on the foundation's rooftop garden where she'd created a memorial space for victims of corporate crime. Her mother's photo held the place of honor, surrounded by flowers that bloomed year-round. "You be proud, Mama," she whispered to the evening air. "We didn't just survive. We built something beautiful from the pieces." Tomorrow would bring celebration, recognition, and the announcement of the foundation's expansion into 3 more states. But tonight was for reflection, for honoring the journey from that awful moment and an altar to this moment of quiet triumph. The girl who'd been humiliated in front of Charleston's elite had become the woman who'd transformed Charleston itself, proving that sometimes the best way to heal from betrayal is to make sure no one else has to face it alone. She walked into that church as a victim. She walked out as a legend, proving that sometimes the best way to heal from betrayal is to make sure it never happens to anyone else. The same Magnolia Hall that had witnessed her humiliation now celebrated her triumph. Filled not with Charleston's elite, but with the women she'd empowered, their voices rising in harmony where silence once reigned. 2 years after the wedding that never was, Alyssa stood before a crowd that looked nothing like the one that had watched Brandon destroy her dignity. These were working mothers and small business owners, scholarship recipients and legal aid clients, women who'd found their voices because she'd refused to lose hers. The chandeliers still gleamed, the marble columns still soared, but the power in the room had shifted completely. When I walked down this aisle 2 years ago, Alyssa said from the same spot where she'd been publicly humiliated, "I thought love meant being grateful for whatever scraps of respect someone was willing to give me." Picture this final scene. What had once been a sinister moment of orchestrated cruelty had transformed into something beautifully ambient, as Alyssa's journey from victim to victor created a tapestry of hope that even veteran officers of justice found profoundly moving. The crowd included faces from every chapter of her story. Maria Santos, whose restaurant had become a Charleston landmark. Marcus Monroe, starting his sophomore year at Charleston Southern on a full scholarship. Sarah Whitlock, who'd transformed from enabler to advocate, and dozens of women who'd found the courage to leave abusive relationships or report workplace harassment after seeing Alyssa's example. I learned that real love doesn't ask you to be grateful for basic human dignity. Alyssa continued, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd earned through 2 years of systematic change. Real love sees your worth before you do, and builds you up instead of tearing you down. The video screen behind her showed the foundation's impact in numbers that still felt impossible. 847 families helped, $2.3 million in recovered assets, 156 scholarship recipients, 89 successful prosecutions of corporate fraud. But the real numbers were harder to measure. The dreams restored, the voices found, the systems changed. The Magnolia Foundation isn't just about helping victims, Alyssa said. It's about preventing future victims by creating a culture where abuse has consequences and courage is rewarded. In the audience, she spotted a familiar face that made her heart skip. Judge Martinez, who'd sentenced Brandon and approved the Victim Restitution Fund, now served on the Foundation's advisory board. The woman who delivered justice from the bench was helping create systems to prevent future crimes. But it was the empty chair in the front row that held the most meaning, reserved for her mother, whose courage in collecting evidence for 20 years had made everything possible. "My mother taught me that silence protects the wrong people," Alyssa said, her voice softening as she looked at that empty chair. "She showed me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to stay quiet about injustice, even when speaking up costs you everything." The Foundation's latest project represented the full circle of her journey, a program that worked directly with wedding venues, florists, and event planners to identify signs of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and domestic violence. They'd created protocols for vendors to safely connect victims with resources, turning the wedding industry into an early warning system for abuse. "We've trained 400 wedding professionals across South Carolina to recognize warning signs," reported the program director during the annual presentation. 17 women have been connected with legal aid before marriages that would have been disasters. 17 women who wouldn't have to experience what Alyssa went through. 17 families spared the devastation of financial abuse and emotional cruelty. The math of prevention was beautiful. Every woman who escaped an abusive relationship potentially saved her children, her friends, her community from generational trauma. So what would you do if someone tried to break you publicly? Would you break, or would you build something unbreakable from the pieces? Comment below with what you learned from Alyssa's journey about turning pain into power. The evening's final surprise was a video message that had been kept secret from everyone, including Alyssa. The screen filled with the face of Dr. Angela Chun, the federal prosecutor who'd built the case against Brandon and his father. Ms. Monroe, Dr. Chun said from her Washington, D.C. office, "Your investigation didn't just bring justice to Charleston. It inspired changes in federal law. The Magnolia Act, passed last month, strengthens protections for victims of corporate fraud and creates funding streams for victim assistance programs nationwide. The Magnolia Act, federal legislation named after her foundation, creating systematic change that would help thousands of families across the country." Alyssa sat in stunned silence as the audience erupted in celebration around her. The courage you showed in documenting crimes, speaking truth to power, and building something positive from destruction has become a model for victim advocacy nationwide, Dr. Chun continued. You didn't just survive betrayal. You transformed it into systematic justice. As the evening wound down and guests shared stories of transformation over Maria's catered feast, Alyssa found herself standing in the exact spot where Brandon had humiliated her 2 years earlier. The marble floor looked the same, the acoustics were identical, but everything else had changed. "Any regrets?" asked Sarah Whitlock, joining her in the quiet moment. "About Brandon? About the wedding? About any of it?" Alyssa considered the question seriously. 2 years of federal investigations, court proceedings, media attention, and systematic rebuilding. 2 years of turning the worst moment of her life into the foundation for helping hundreds of other women find their voices. "If I hadn't overheard that phone call, if he hadn't humiliated me at this altar, if his family hadn't built their fortune on systematic theft." She paused, thinking about all the families who'd been helped, all the women who'd escaped abuse, all the systematic changes that had grown from her personal pain. No regrets. Some stories need to end with healing instead of hatred. Some betrayals are gifts in disguise. They show you who people really are before it's too late to protect yourself. The last guests were leaving as Alyssa made her final walk down the aisle of Magnolia Hall. But this time, she wasn't walking toward a man who'd promised to love her while planning to use her. She was walking towards something far more valuable. A community of women who'd chosen courage over silence, justice over revenge, and systematic change over personal destruction. The best revenge wasn't getting even with Brandon Whitlock. The best revenge was making sure no other woman would have to smile through humiliation the way she had, making sure no other family would be destroyed by corporate fraud the way hers was. The best revenge was becoming someone who built bridges instead of burning them, who created opportunities instead of destroying them, who proved that dignity couldn't be taken away, only temporarily misplaced until you remembered your own worth. If this story of turning humiliation into empowerment inspired you, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to stay down when life knocked them over. Tell me in the comments which moment from Alyssa's journey resonated most with you. And remember, sometimes the quiet ones aren't weak, they're just planning something spectacular. The best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting better and making sure others never have to go through what you did.